Hello, my quilty friends. It's Stacy of Stacy Creates Stuff, and today I have a new quilt tutorial for you. I recently came across this gorgeous collection from Moda Fabrics called Serena Shores, and of course, I just had to design a quilt using it. And I threw in a little bit of a batik, Hoffman batik, just to add a little spice. The concept behind this quilt was to just make some nice, simple blocks with a focus fabric in the center and a border around that fabric with two different fabrics to sort of highlight that center piece. I call this pattern Dotted Square because that square in the center then has this not quite dotted, but syncopated border around it with these two fabrics. And I thought that that was a really fun way to highlight this collection of fabrics. The construction of this quilt is relatively straightforward. I'm going to walk you through how to create these dotted borders around the center blocks, and also how to make quarter square triangles and an interesting way to do a border, especially when you either don't have quite enough fabric. I had plenty of fabric, but more importantly, sometimes the pattern on the border fabric, you just don't want to have a seam that disrupts that pattern while trying to continue the pattern. See what I mean? So I came up with a solution for this quilt that has a subtle way of staying within that color, but yet not having to worry about trying to match up the pattern. So stick around and see how that gets accomplished. Here we are with the components of this quilt. So the two main parts of the blocks are the lime green and the blue. Beautiful fabrics here. So I have cut those squares. For the border that goes around those centers, we have strips of the teal and then also of the batik. And we're going to be sewing these together rather than cutting them into separate pieces and sewing them together. I find it's easier to go ahead and sew these strips together. We'll have one strip set that is made up of 3 teal and 2 blue, and another strip set that is 2 blue and 1 teal, and we'll be cutting these down. So this will be cut into smaller segments like this is. And you will make one full strip set like this, one full strip set like this, and then you'll make half-length strip sets with the remaining strips. I hope that makes sense. In the instructions, it's all written out. And then we have our sashing. So I cut a width this way, and then subcut that into the widths that I need for the sashing. And then we also have the squares, which are going to become quarter square triangles. And they look like this. So here are my two seashell fabrics, and these, even though it's hard to tell on this one, but these two fabrics are the white main fabric. Now, to make these, I have a little trick for you. We're going to be sewing these together to make half square triangles, and then we're going to sew those two half square triangle units together to make the quarter square. And I'm going to show you all that in just a moment. But the other trick is that after I have cut my two strips, I place the strips, and I'll just demonstrate with the sashing strips here. I take my two strips and I place them right sides together, and then I cut them into the increments that I need. And with the right sides together like that, all matched up, put these back. When I go to pull, I just take the top two off the stack. They're all ready to go. Like, I don't have to take one square and one square from here and match them up. They're already matched up because I cut them together. So that's a little trick to help speed things along in making this quilt. So let me show you how to make quarter square triangle units. All right, I'm going to go ahead and trim down my units for the little block border. And these you just cut off in the dimensions that are given in the instructions. To make the main block units, you have your square, and this fabric is sort of directional, so keep that in mind if you feel like it needs to be directional with the, I guess, the coral pieces in the background there. You're going to be sewing 2 side pieces. Once those are sewn together, you will go ahead and place the top and bottom border. Sew that together and you will have your block. I'm going to take my squares. Now I usually use my sandpaper board to do this, but because I have them already right sides together ready to go, I'm not. Because when I do that, the top fabric isn't gripped by the sandpaper, and so it's just going to slide around anyway. So I find in this case, it's just easier to do it this way. I have my quarter square ruler here, and I am aligning the corner of the block, those squares, in the center area, and then I am drawing on each side. So I think you can see that there. And these are where I'm going to sew. If you don't have a quick quarter tool, they're fabulous, by the way. Of course, you can use a regular ruler. And in that case, I would align 1/4 inch in. So that line that goes through my ruler, and then I can make that mark. I just have to slide my ruler over, realign, make my mark. And I'm all good. Or, turn it around. Either way. I'm ambidextrous. It kind of just goes either way. Now, when I go to sew, what is important is that I kind of sew more towards the inside of this line. So I don't want to sew right on it. I want to really sew a little towards the center. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew those 2. I'm going to come back and I'll show you what's next. Here is my sewn piece, and you can see I did sew just inside those drawn lines. I'm going to go ahead and cut this apart. And I just kind of want to cut towards that center, like right on the center, best I can. It is not the end of the world if your cut is a little slightly off. It's fine. Now I'm going to go ahead and press, and I am choosing to press all of my triangles towards the white print fabric with the starfish on them, as opposed to the shells. So you just want to make sure that you're consistent. It doesn't matter in this particular case. They're both very light fabrics, but you want to be consistent. I'm always going to be pressing away from the shells. So let me press. All right, here we are pressed. So I'm going to lay 1 down, and then my shells are here at the top, so I want my shells to be here at the bottom. And you've done it right, and this is why it was important to press both seams in the same direction towards the same type of fabric, because that way your seams will nest. And you just want to kind of, make sure that the seam is nesting, and that for the most part, they're pretty close here on the side. In other words, you don't want it to, and I'm just exaggerating, you don't want it to be real far off. So they don't necessarily have to line up exactly on the edges. It is more important that they line up where the seams are nesting. And then you are going to repeat the process. So at this point we have half square triangles. Now to make them quarter square, again, I am just aligning using my quarter square marking tool here. And I'm going to sew again just to the inside of these lines. Be right back. Here we are with that seam sewn. Again, cut these apart. And when I open them up, we have our quarter square triangles, but we're not quite done. I need to, of course, press these open, and I can do that to the seam. Open it up so that essentially the seam's pinwheel around the center, that helps to lessen the bulk. So I will do that, press both of those, and then we need to trim it to our size that we need for putting them together. So you can see that they're just a little bit bigger, and that is perfect. We just want to, just like in a half square triangle, just trim off that little bit of excess and get them perfectly square. All right, now that my pieces are pressed, I'm going to bring over my handy dandy spinning mat. I just love this for trimming half square and quarter square triangles. And I do have my bias square ruler, also helpful. Now, unlike half square triangles where all you have to worry about is aligning your diagonal with the diagonal printed on the ruler and making sure you have enough of an overhang, here we need to do a little extra, and that is align it with the diagonal, and then also make sure, in this particular case, I'm trimming them to 2.5 inches. So half of 2.5 is 1.25. It's not terribly hard math. And I want to make sure that the 1.25 mark is hitting that point, that intersection where all 4 corners meet. So just to show you on a more high contrast sample, this one I've obviously already trimmed, but I'm making sure that the 1.25 is at that point before I start trimming. So bringing this one back along the diagonal, 1.25 at that point. Hopefully I have at least a little bit of fabric beyond the 2.5. That's why it's important to do that scant 1/4 inch. It's fine to even move when you're sewing on the lines on either side of your quick quarter. You can really move them in. All right, let's spin this around, do the other side. Now at this point, it's going to measure, in this particular case, 2.5 inches, and hopefully my 1.25 will already match up. It should. And there I have my finished quarter square triangle. Now it is time to talk borders. So I've already put the borders on the quilt, and I'm going to tell you how I went about that. So of course, all the blocks are done in rows. There are 4 rows with each with 3 blocks. And I've alternated between the lime and the blue, opposite on the next row, duplicated that second row, and then repeated the first row. So I have sort of a X sort of thing going on with the green ones. That's just how I liked it. You could arrange your blocks however you want. All the blocks are sashed with our blue and white seashells on the horizontal and the white coral and shells on the vertical. So all that we've put together. To further frame that out, I have added a 1-inch inner border. That's a finished 1 inch. And I did that by cutting 1.5 inches and sewing a really long strip of the number of pieces required. And then to sew that on, I sewed the verticals first, and I measured the edge of my quilt, both edges, and also the center. And then I averaged out those numbers. Cut 2 pieces that length, sew those on. Then I went back and I measured across the top, now with that inner border on, across the center and across the bottom. Averaged those measurements, cut 2 lengths, and sewed those pieces on. That took care of the inner border. Fairly easy. The outer border is a little bit more complicated, but not by much. So there are two pieces that you will cut that are going to be the center of the top and the bottom, and two pieces that are the center of each side. The other pieces of our blue border are a strip that is cut in half. In between those pieces, I utilized a width of the same fabric that I used going around the little block border. That just helped to break it up, and because it was a similar color, it didn't distract, but it does kind of add a little extra element out there. Also, what this did was prevent me from having to sew a seam that would disrupt the pattern of the shells. I certainly could have done that, and if you wish to do that, there's enough fabric in the kit to do that, and enough fabric in the instructions, what it calls for, you can accomplish that. But I wanted to kind of break it up a little bit. So we'll look at the top here. It's a little easier to see. So I took that piece, I sewed those little accent pieces on each side, sewed a length, well, half of a length of the strip to each side of that. Well, I did the verticals first. So I measured the left, center, and right of the quilt and found the average. Then I took that length, divided it in half. I took my outer border, folded it, matching up those accent rectangles, and then I cut from the fold down to the half length of the total length. Does that make sense? For the top and bottom outer border, I can use that same measurement that I used for the inner top and bottom border. I don't need to remeasure, and that is because the extra width is going to come from those corner squares that are little 4 patches made up of the teal shells and the blue shells. This is a great way to do a border when you don't have either quite enough fabric or you don't want to break up the print that is on the fabric by having a seam and trying to have to either make them match or just they don't match anywhere near at all. So I had a great time designing and making this quilt, and I am excited to say that kits are available exclusively from my favorite quilt shop, Vintage Pink and Green. There is a link in the description below. A standalone pattern for this quilt is not currently available, but when it does become available, I will add that to the description below. If you like videos like this, why not subscribe to my YouTube channel? Hit the subscribe button below and also the bell notification so that you will know when my next video drops. Until next time, my friends, why not check out this one?